On this week's episode of the Going Deeper podcast, we are talking birth control. What's up, Fathom Church, and welcome to the Going Deeper podcast. This is your host, Kyle Knight. And again, these are episodes we love to just talk about a topic and go deeper into it to hopefully help you go deeper in your relationship with God. I'm in the podcast studio with our very own missions minister, Karina Bost. Hello,
Hey.
Karina.
KB in the house.
And our lead pastor, Chris Martin. Hello, Chris.
What up?
In the house.
In the house.
In the house. What up? As you can see by the title of this episode and everything, we're going to be talking about birth control. And just to kind of start this out, this was suggested to us by a member of our church who just wrote us an email. And again, this is what's so great, and what we like to say all the time is like, man, if you have a topic that you'd like us to discuss and like to hear a little bit more about it from our perspective, and send it to us, email us or whatever. But I just wanted to kind of read it for you all, and just sort of to prep us in this conversation. And we've taken out names and everything like that. But this is what the email said to us from one of the members of our church about this topic. It said, it says, personally, I didn't grow up in the church, and starting birth control at 15 or 16 years old was just seen as a totally normal thing. There wasn't much thought behind it. But now that I'm following Jesus, I find myself wanting to understand this through a biblical lens. I know the Bible doesn't directly address birth control, but I wonder if you could just discuss some principles in Scripture that could help guide Christians as they make decisions around this. So that's what was sent to us, which is an absolutely awesome thing to send us and to be thinking about and to be kind of wrestling with. And so that's what we love to hear from church, from you guys. So Chris, I'm going to throw it over to you as we kind of got this email, this question to talk about birth control. And as it says, yes, the Bible doesn't directly address this, but before we hit record, we were talking about there's some places we need to start with this conversation. So why don't you kick us off?
Okay. So I, knowing that this was coming, I did a little bit of research, leaned into John Piper. He had some helpful things. So I have some Piper stuff and then some other thoughts, but this is where Piper starts with kind of the biblical framework to talk about this. He wants to talk about marriage. He wants to talk about children. And then I think from there, we start to ask the question, okay, what do we do with this? So let me quickly give you a couple of scriptures. Genesis chapter 2. Let's see here. Verse 18. The Lord said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him." So this is obviously Adam is in the garden. It's not good. Everything else is good, but it's not good that he be alone. So God makes a mate for him, a helpmate. He makes Eve, creates Eve for him, from him, with the purpose of completing and complementing Adam. And so we would say that in the Garden of Eden, marriage is the expected reality for completeness and wholeness of the creative order. Mm-hmm. That having a marriage, having a partner, is how one is complete. Now, I want to say this is before the fall. So this is before sin enters the equation, but marriage is normative before the fall. Mm-hmm. Additionally, back in chapter 1 of Genesis, we find the creative mandate, which God says, be fruitful and multiply. So not only is marriage normative before the fall, but procreation is normative before the fall. So now the reason why Piper brings that up, why I want to bring that up in to start, is that we were created in our original state to have a complement in a marriage. Mm-hmm. So that's men and women in a biblical marriage is a pre-fall idea. It's a Garden of Eden idea. Additionally, having children seems to be the normative expectation before the fall. I say all of that to say the fall really messed some stuff up when it comes to this. So we do not live in a pre-Genesis 3 world. We live in a post-Genesis 3 world where marital relationships have been fractured, where sexual relationships have been fractured, where even the multiplication of our species has felt the pangs and the effects of the fall. One of the repercussions of the fall is that childbirth is now not going to be a pleasant thing. It's going to be a difficult thing. So Piper would then take the argument and say, okay, while that is normative before Genesis 3, after Genesis 3, marriage is not normative. It still is a good thing. It is a good thing to find a wife, is what the Proverbs say. But it is not a normative thing. In fact, both Jesus and Paul seem to imply that singleness is a viable option because of for the right reasons. For the right reasons, singleness is a viable option, specifically so that one might devote themselves to the purposes of the Lord more wholeheartedly. That marriage and even children are considered at some level a distraction from kingdom ministry. That's not to make a moral judgment on having kids or being married, but Paul seems to say, hey, it'd be better if you could stay single. Like if you have that ability and the Lord calls you to that, that's actually an awesome option. So that would then mean that marriage is no longer normative, nor is procreation the gold standard. So some Christians will say, if you are married, you should have as many kids as you possibly can. That's one stance on the idea. I'm not sure I feel comfortable going that far because we no longer live in a pre-Genesis 3 world where both are normative, both are without sin, and both are glorifying to God fully. I think having too many children could be, I'm saying that really carefully, could be dishonoring to the Lord. Now, it could be honoring to the Lord, but in a fallen world, it could be dishonoring to the Lord. So the reason why I bring all of that up is you to frame up the conversation for birth control, you have to start with the conversation of, are human beings called to be married and to procreate naturally as much as possible? And I would say, from a pastoral biblical standpoint, I don't think so. I think there's more complexity to it than every Christian should be married and every Christian should have as many babies as they possibly can. So that's kind of throwing a little bit of shade at the full quiver mentality of like, hey, you know what? Just have as many babies as you can. The quiver of the man who has, a full quiver is blessed or whatever. Yeah, that's Psalm 127. Yep. So that's kind of the starting place.
Good place to start.
Any thoughts on that from you guys in terms of just kind of the setting the ground for marriage and children as non-normative, not a requirement for all Christians?
I think what I was processing was just like historically, as population grows, actually in certain parts of the world, like they can't handle the growth that's already happening. So where we see that it's not necessarily now the normative, but we also see that it can cause cultural problems as well.
Yeah.
So I think that's the right place to begin, is to say, okay, the Bible at least doesn't explicitly teach that everyone should have as many babies as possible. Okay. Then you start moving into the question of, okay, so what do we do with birth control?
Yeah.
The question asker said there is no verse about birth control, and I would agree with that. I don't think there's any one verse that talks about this. There is one place in Genesis 38, which we've covered in the past. I think we even covered when we talked about masturbation in this, but the sin of Onan, we've talked about this. I've talked about this in sermons, but the brother of his wife, he dies. The wife, by, I think it's like Deuteronomy 38 or something that prescribes that a brother shall provide children for his brother's widow. This man named Onan is the younger brother of He ends up having sex with this woman, and she, the text says he spills his seed on the ground, right? Which is
because he knew his offspring wouldn't.
He
be
knew his
his
offspring would not be his; they would essentially be his
Right.
brother's
Yeah.
children.
Yeah.
And so that
Yeah.
was not what he wanted to do. And so some people would say,
then
because
what
that is
happened
a,
to him?
and then he died.
And they
The
died.
Lord struck him down.
Right.
And so some people will say, well, that's like ancient
Yikes.
birth control,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, and that's why God says don't use birth control, because it was a sin for Onan not to produce children. And it was a cultural sin. It was a biblical sin, but it's not because he pulled out. Like that's not the birth control is not the sin. It's failing to do his right as a brother based in the Old Testament law.
I think that's super. I was reading about that. I think that's super important.
So
that's why it's
a sin. It's not a sin to not give every opportunity for a sperm to connect with an egg and procreate. So I don't think Genesis 38 is really talking about this. And then of course we can always go to what I already mentioned, Psalm 127, which is children are a heritage from the Lord. So we must agree with the idea that children are a heritage. They are a blessing. They are a gift. They are a good thing, but they're not commanded of every Christian to have as many as they possibly can.
Well, and even just in that, just like a side note, because as I was reading that too, it's like, and like you said about marriage too, it's like a husband and a wife, like those are gifts too, but not required for a Christian. Like you talked about singleness and those sorts of things. So gifts, good things, but still not like you have to do it.
So that's all the Bible I could think of when it came to this. So then we're left with exercising wisdom. We're left with trying to discern then in a post-fall world with a biblical worldview, at what level should Christians feel comfortable using birth control? Are there certain types? Are there levels of permanence that we need to consider? There's lots that we need to think about in this. And so I think what I'll say with one last thing before we kind of dive into this is that this is something we should tread lightly on. This is not something, I know we talk a lot about issues here of conscience, matters of conscience. There are parts of this discussion that we're going to have to agree are matters of conscience. We can't point to verse and chapter about where God would draw a hard line on some of this stuff. Now, I would argue that there are some parts of this that God draws a very hard line on. But I think we just want to open-handed hold this thing. This is not a primary issue. This is not an issue necessary for salvation. This is a secondary or tertiary issue that we just want to be open-handed with. So,
yeah, I think that's a good place to start. And even though it's not a primary thing, it's obviously something that is permeating through all of like culture, but also like just in the church and growing up in the church as well, and people who've had different backgrounds, like the person who wrote in of like whether they grew up with it, different views, or joining the church, they have different views now, or like vice versa and stuff. And so, this is definitely like a conversation that I think we should have and we need to have. So can we start with, I've got a bunch of questions here, and maybe I'd love to start with, can we talk about maybe biblically, and I think we might have mentioned this on some podcasts, I swear we have, but when does life begin? Can we kind of talk about that first? Just to, again, kind of start with a baseline of what we believe as Christians when life begins. Because that's kind of that's a big deal. Maybe I think this was the abortion episode that we actually talked about.
Yep.
When life begins. So let's talk about that first.
I'll pass this one to KB.
Alrighty. Well, one of the main verses in referencing the start of life is Psalms 139, where you made all the delicate inner parts of my body and knit me together in my mother's womb, and that we were made complex. You can read the whole passage 13 through 16, but that gives a clear indication that we are created from conception. And I think, if you want, we covered it really in detail in the abortion one, but
so life, the biblical Christian worldview, the lens that we see this question being answered from is that life begins at conception, at fertilization,
Mhm.
when an egg and a sperm unite to create a new life. That is when life begins. Now,
that's a good point.
that then leads us to the other questions.
It leads us to the other questions. Now, in that, like we have to, I think we kind of have to think of maybe like a lot of methods of birth control.
Right.
Okay, we can start there. Where do we want to start?
Yeah.
With that.
Well, so there's I'm not, by the way, I'm no expert in this. Okay. So
we all are.
Yeah.
Not.
None of us are experts.
So, again,
we're in this little closet talking about this. So let's just say that. But okay. So there's multiple forms of birth control. Okay. The most obvious kind of slap yourself in the head way is abstinence. Okay.
Mhm.
So like you can abstain from having intercourse, and that's a form of birth control.
Right.
Mhm.
Although Paul speaks to that when he
Mhm.
says, don't withhold yourself.
Mhm.
If you're in a marital relationship, unless you're devoting yourselves to a season of prayer and fasting, you need to conjugally unite with your spouse. So
Mhm.
don't abstain from sex just because you don't want to have kids.
Mhm.
That's an important thing to think about.
Mhm.
So that's just one piece, okay, of the larger conversation. Abstinence is the best way to avoid having children.
Yes,
And
it
it's
is.
also not a healthy thing
Mhm.
for a marriage.
Mhm.
Mhm.
To practice abstinence in a marriage is not the ideal. It is
Mhm.
not what marriage is supposed to be, what sex is supposed to be in marriage. So that's kind of a no duh, but we should say that. Okay.
Gotta say it. Yep.
Then you move into essentially what, I don't know. There's really in my mind, three kind of categories of birth control in terms of what they're trying to do.
Mhm.
One is preventing fertilization
Mhm.
of an egg. Okay. That can be done with a hormonal birth control, or that can be done with a shield of some sort, right?
Mhm.
So there's all kinds of different types of this, but that birth control is trying to prevent conception,
Right.
trying to prevent an egg and a sperm meeting up and
Mhm.
fertilization happening, life occurring. Okay. Another way or type, I guess, of birth control is one that essentially affects females and prevents them from ovulating. So prevents them from dropping an egg and giving the option for this. Now that's still doing the same thing. It's preventing fertilization,
Mhm.
but it's just preventing it earlier than, some sort of barrier or something like that. And then there's a third type of birth control, or a third method of birth control, which is preventing implantation. So this is what many, as far as I understand it, what many hormonal birth controls will do as a line of defense is, if an egg does happen to get fertilized by a sperm, these birth controls prevent or diminish the chances that egg will implant in the uterus and actually take root and begin to grow. So we have issues of ovulation, we have issues of fertilization, we have issues of implantation. Okay. So I did a little bit of research. I had never really thought about this, but I was looking into what most hormonal birth control, so a birth control pill, okay, not condoms, not that kind of prevention method, but of a hormonal birth control pill. And I was reading some of the fine print on this, and they, at least the one that I was reading, which I don't remember which one it was, but said that it does all three of those things. It initially and primarily tries to alter the ovulation cycle so that eggs aren't released. Okay. That's the first line of defense, but it's not the only line of defense. The second line of defense is that it thickens the mucus or something like that to make it a hostile environment for eggs and sperm to connect. So that's a second line of defense with a hormonal birth control. But then there's a third line of defense that some hormonal birth controls have, which they cause a thinning of the uterine line to prevent implantation of a already fertilized egg. So this is why these pills are pretty effective modes of birth control, because they have three barriers. And what I read is that and I don't know if they know the statistics on this or the percentage chances of this. I have no idea, but they said very, very often most pregnancies are stopped in 1 and 2, but number 3 is there. The implantation piece is there just in case. So by our definition of life, a sperm and an egg meet and fertilization occurs. That's conception. Even before it is implanted, we would say that is a life. And therefore, some hormonal birth controls could be seen as abortive. Now, I'd never really thought about that.
Right.
And so Marcy and I, when we first got married, she was on the pill for a little while, but it didn't make her feel good. She did not like it. And so then she got off of that, and we did other methods of birth control. But I had to kind of like think about this the last couple of weeks, that like there could have been statistically children that we unknowingly aborted. And it was just one of those things that struck me, and I thought I had never really thought about that because I didn't read the fine print of the birth control. We just kind of assumed, hey, this prevents pregnancy. And it does prevent pregnancy, but is pregnancy when life begins? Right. Or is it when a sperm and an egg meet, creating a unique life form? So now that's why I say we've got to hold this with an open hand, is because that feels kind of ticky-tacky. And I want to be wholeheartedly committed to life, especially as I see it in the Bible. So that's really where my brain starts to is going at this moment, is to say, I'm not saying that every Christian should stay away from hormonal birth control, but I do believe every Christian should be vehemently committed to preserving life and opposed to terminating life, if at all possible. So I don't know. This is where my brain has been kind of messed up on this. And I'd love to know what you guys think as I've just kind of run you down that rabbit trail.
Yeah, I think it's super important to think through that. And I think like education is a huge piece of that, like just being aware, because we do a lot of things when we're unaware. But once you become aware, it's like taking the time to process that and being like, is that something I want to risk? Is that something that I feel like is a hard, like, no, I don't want to abort a life even accidentally kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think even more so, well, not more so, that's a weird word. No. Additionally, there's like health complications.
Right.
So I think just being, if you're a younger gal and you're taking birth control, fertility issues are at like a record high. Yeah. And I think there's a reason for that. So I think like that's part of this conversation too, which is in the Bible. I just think it's an important piece to think through. Like you can start, and I know being a mom of a daughter, I know that they start pushing birth control at 14. So as a mom, you need to be aware of that. And then even, as a young lady, processing like, hey, this, the 3 phases of birth, like of protection in pregnancy, but then also like, how is this going to affect me when I want to start having children?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I agree with all that. And even when me and Jackie got married, she was on birth control too, but it also kind of affected her in other ways and just totally screwed with her, like just everything. And so she got off it. But yeah, and I agree. Even just with this instance, it just made me think of like, yes, be wise in reading things, everything like that. But to me, it just harkens back to like this communication with you and your spouse of like, just always be talking about this, be open with each other, read those things together like you and Marcy did. And it's just like do this with your spouse. I think that's so important to have wisdom, but like do it lovingly with your partner and figuring this stuff out and praying through all this kind of stuff. And if you're sitting there and you're reading and you're like, oh, I don't really know, but keep talking about it, keep praying about it, those sorts of things. So, yeah, it's a complicated thing, but but use, again, and we say this a lot, even on this podcast, like use your brain,
Right.
like think about it, pray about it, and these sorts of things. So
then Piper, to then take it maybe to the next, I don't know if it's logical question or not, but so you need to think about birth control. Okay. Especially if you're younger, you need to think about what are you thinking? And I want to move into the why behind that in just a minute, but let's do one other piece before we get there. I think for some of maybe our older listeners, I'm not super old, but like, as you move towards the end of your childbearing years, one of the questions becomes permanent birth control. So sterilization for either the man or the woman, whether that's, tying the tubes or getting a vasectomy. One of the questions that kind of comes on the heels here is permanent birth control okay? Is that acceptable? And is that something that Christians should consider? I know what Piper says, and I think I agree with him. So, but I would love to know if you guys have any initial thoughts on that before I, drop another Piper bomb on us.
I'll give my initial thoughts on that. And my initial thoughts is I don't have an answer, but me and Jackie have talked about these sorts of things as we're getting older. And I've really questioned this on whether or not, and I don't know where I stand yet because I haven't done deep enough research or prayer about it. But I've kind of thought of that and been like, I don't know, but it's something that we've talked about recently. So I'm not sure. So I'd be very curious to see what he says.
That's a really interesting question. And I think just based on where this conversation has been already, if marriage isn't mandatory and children isn't mandatory or mandated, then the longevity of that seems to be in the same playing field of it's not mandatory that I have kids when I'm 20 or when I'm 40.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. I do think it's, again, an open-handed issue. Okay. We can't point to chapter and verse on this. But Piper makes a really interesting conversation piece. He said, you don't know what you don't know about what's coming.
Sure. And
the finality. Now I know that you can have procedures to reverse things. And so okay, I get it.
Nowadays,
but he said you just don't know. And he said, this is morbid to consider, but you don't know that your spouse is going to continue living. If you get a vasectomy and your spouse dies and you go through the mourning process and a couple of years later you marry somebody else and they want to have kids, you might be like, hey, I don't ever want to have kids again, but you're not considering the potential of a next spouse, even in that conversation. So he would say, be very careful about making lifelong decisions like that without all the data. And the reality is none of us have all the data. So I think that's an interesting way to think about this. Okay. Now there is a natural baked in, especially for women with menopause, there's a natural baked in kind of end to the cycle, not for men so much, but for women for sure. But Piper's main question is, why do you want to end the possibility permanently? And his whole, and I think this is really interesting. He said, as he's gotten older, he realizes how much more the liberties and freedoms of this day and age, his culture, affects his decision-making process as opposed to the true biblical worldview. And so if the question is, well, I just don't want the trouble of more children. Okay. Why? Is it, I don't think medically it's safe for me to be pregnant again. Okay. That's a different reason. If it's, I'm a one and done or a two and done or a three and done and I just don't want anymore. Well, again, why? Well, what happens if you get remarried at some point? What happens in those scenarios? And he would just say, be very intentional about processing through your motives on that, because you might find that the world is really influencing your understanding and desire for this reality. That children are not actually a blessing in your eyes. They're actually a burden in your eyes. And you're looking for a loophole so that you don't have to deal with that headache. Well, that's a different posture than, well, it would be unsafe for us to start having kids now, or, like different, there's lots of different ways. But I would just say, I think what I took away from reading Piper on this was, hey, we should probably think a little bit more about this. Yeah. It's not just as easy as, oh yeah, well, it's, it's an outpatient thing and who cares? It's just everybody does that. And that way we don't have to worry about kids anymore. Why don't you want to worry about kids anymore? Like, have you really thought that through? Have you really prayed that through? Have you talked with community about that? Because I think that'd be wise to consider.
Yeah. And I think, so our personal experience that makes me think back to like, just me and Jackie ever since we've been married and starting a family and everything, and motives for sure. And like, I'm guilty of some of those. Our journey was like, it took us a long time to get pregnant for Austin. Like we had quite a few miscarriages in there. And so it was really hard. Had Austin, he's healthy. It's great. And then we went through the same kind of process again to get pregnant with Caroline. Like they're 4 years apart and we tried to have them closer. So we wanted it, but we had some more miscarriages and especially one that was a little bit further along that was really hard for us, that made us think of like motives behind this, or like, what do we do? Like, maybe this is what like God's will is for us to have one kid. And then by God's grace, we got pregnant again and had Caroline after one of our miscarriages. And then ever since then, now that our youngest is 4, almost 5, we've gone through a lot of that talking of motives and whether like, do we want more kids? Like, does the Lord want us to have more kids? And we've never closed that door, and we've always tried to be open to that. Now, there's been some times in our lives over the last like 4 years, we've been like, like we would love to, like we have these conversations of like, we'd love to have like another kid. But then the world part of it kind of comes in and we go, well, like with job stuff and my wife back to teaching, childcare would be really hard. And that would be really expensive. And then that would be another 3 years of that. Like, so yeah, we're guilty of like those kind of things sort of seeping in and being like, it makes us think like, oh, why do like, is that the reason why we're not trying to have another kid and everything? And so we just go through a lot of prayer. We still believe. And we even had this conversation with Austin the other day, because Austin just had a birthday and he every now and then will throw out this thing like, I wish I had another sibling or something like that. And we're like, okay. And, but we have these conversations of like, yeah, like the Lord has us as a family of 4 right now. And who knows what God is going to bring in our future, but that's what he has now. But which is all great. I wish we could, like, I could say that I've had that posture all the time of like, yeah, the Lord's what, like, we'll just go with whatever. But there's been some times where I've almost tried to control that more, but also be like, yeah, we're not doing this because it wouldn't be wise of us. We don't have like, the money issue, the living issue, or how, like, all those kind of things really do creep in and make you think a lot more, which is, so that's really good to kind of revisit that of like, what are my motives? What are me and my wife's motives of like thinking whether or not we're like, yes, we want to, or no, like we are done having kids.
Yeah, I think the why question is actually, something to consider here. So regardless of your age, if you're, 21 and married, or if you're, 37 and married, the question of why don't I want kids right now is a question that you should do some honest reflection in. So I do a lot of premarital counseling, and one of the things that often kind of gets laid out there in premarital is like, so when do you guys want to start having kids? And it's always like, oh yeah, we want to do 3 years or 5 years, or, depending on the age, obviously, of the couple, that can vary. And when I got married, Marcy and I said 5 years. That was kind of like, hey, that's what we want to do. Thinking that like we needed to establish some sort of foundation before kids.
Right.
And as I think back, I think I maybe regret that a little bit, that 5-year thing. Now for us, a year into marriage, Marcy got sick, and 5 years in, she was still sick. And then it wasn't until we were 7 or 8 years in that we ended up having Harper after a miscarriage. But I feel like I wish I could go back and just at 23 when we got married, just say, okay, let's just see what happens. Let's see what the Lord does. Because like everything, and this is where I think maybe my own counsel has been problematic in the past, even, is you're never ready is the first thing. And some of the delight of even getting married early, like when I hear people say, oh, I'm not ready to get married yet. It's like, no, you know what? You don't need your whole life figured out in order to be ready to get married.
Yep.
Like, I understand getting married in your 30s. That's fine. But I think if you can, at 21, make dumb mistakes with your spouse and figure it out together. I mean, some of our best years are when we're dirt poor and Marcy and I are just kind of slumming it together. And I kind of wish we had faithfully tried that with children as well. I don't know. I mean, the Lord is sovereign, so I don't know. But having a child at 30, I was more mature than I was at 23 when we got married. But I don't know what the Lord would have had for me if I had. I mean, I would have a 17-year-old now, which would be way different. But I don't know. I think that I think my excuses, if I'm honest, were legitimately selfish. I wanted time for me. And I can cloak that with a little bit of relational spirituality, right? Where I can be like, well, I really wanted to build a firm foundation of my wife and I with Christ before, like, okay, yeah. You know what I didn't want to do? I didn't want the responsibility of being a parent when I was 23.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately that motive was pretty immature. That's me. Okay. I'm not trying to read that onto anybody else, but I would encourage our 22, 23, 24-year-old married couples to really consider the real reason why you don't want kids. And then I would also swing the pendulum to our 38, 39, even 40-year-old people to just start to say, I know that that's getting to the end of the window, but why don't you want kids? Are you just sick of diapers? Are you not ready to go back into that world again? Or you just don't want to, or you're like finally found the freedom of not having to pour a bowl of Cheerios for anybody but yourself. Like, I mean, and I'm saying that tongue in cheek, but it also, that can be deeply selfish as well.
Right.
So I feel like I'm reinvestigating my heart on this issue to just say, man, maybe God, I heard one guy say this, the problem with the birth control argument is the word control. And I think that's pretty good. What are you trying to control here? Like, what are you trying to take under your control as opposed to, like we would say, submitting to Christ as Lord? Is Christ Lord over your procreation plans, or are you trying to be Lord over it? So that part is kind of a freaky thing. And I'll just be honest, I don't think I had put enough thought into it until recently. So I don't know. What do you guys think about the why behind this kind of stuff?
Yeah, when I look back to like the moment we decided Peyton was our last one, and just now that I'm processing the why, it was because before Peyton I had 2 miscarriages, and I was like, I'm not doing that again.
Right.
And so the pain, actually avoiding pain, is very selfish as well, because I love Peyton. I'm sure if I had 5 more kids, they would all be super amazing little people. So it's real easy to turn anything into like, oh, I'm just we're just being cautious and protecting ourselves. But I think the root of it is selfishness. I mean, for us, I'm not saying that for everyone.
Right.
Well, and from the guy's perspective in that, like, Jackie hated being pregnant. She struggled with it. We had our miscarriages, all that kind of stuff. It was obviously painful. And so after our second, like, we had so many conversations, and from me, I was like, oh, I don't want my wife to go through that again. And I don't know if, like, that sounds selfish now that we're talking about that. And I'm like, but even from her perspective, she's like, yeah, I don't really want to be pregnant again. And so, I mean, we've had conversations then about like adoption and all that other kind of stuff. And so it's like, yeah, it's a hard thing, because it's like your why is so important. And I agree with you, Chris, that I would encourage like anybody, but like maybe especially our younger couples to like really, really talk about that now.
Yeah. Yeah. This is why we're holding it open-handed, because all of this stuff, none of it is prescriptive, right? Like none of it is black and white in the text, but I think it's worth having these conversations about your motives, about the why. I think there are legitimate reasons why you shouldn't have more children. For us, we would love to have more than Harper, but Marcy's health has prohibited us from having more kids. And so it's like, okay, but that doesn't prohibit us from having a conversation about adoption. Like those kinds of things can come into that conversation as well. And that's something to pray through and consider. The other piece is, I do think there becomes a responsibility issue but I wouldn't, like, sometimes it's financial. Yes. I think that's something you should consider. I think you should consider that less than other things. One thought is, I think you should consider how many children you feel you can disciple adequately. Like if we're to raise our children in the Lord, if we're to shepherd them, if we're about kingdom business, whether it's with our biological children or with children in the faith, as we make disciples, as we fulfill the great commandment of our great commission of Matthew chapter 28, go make disciples. I think that's maybe a better frame of reference when thinking about children, is how many kids can I disciple? Like how many kids. And I think different people have different capacity levels for discipleship. And so some people are sucking at discipling one child. And you need to hear that as an indictment and really prayerfully consider how you are discipling your children. And then some people can disciple 5, 6, 7, 8. Like I could see it. Right. And I think it's a capacity issue and a heart issue. But I like the idea of talking about that rather than, could we send 3 kids to college? Sure. I mean, you cost a living. Okay. Yeah, sure. Whatever. Those things feel superficial comparatively. Right. But if you're not having kids because you don't want to give up traveling or your weekends, or you like to sleep in on most days, I would just encourage you to prayerfully, with wise counsel, seek the Lord's will. At least from the question asker. The question asker, I don't sense, is saying, I don't want to have kids, but like I don't want to be, I don't want to get zapped by God. So like, what should I do about this? I sense it's like, I want to be faithful to what the Lord has for me. Well, then I would say take that seriously, because that's the posture that every Christian should have about every issue. Is my liberty being flaunted here, or am I in true submission to Jesus? Because you have liberty around this. Right. But is it rooted in sinful selfishness, or are you fully submitted to Christ? I think this is a much deeper issue than we on surface level would tend to believe. I think that's a good place to stop. Yeah. And I think next we're going to have to record a follow-up episode on this one, because I think the next logical question is, what happens if I can't have kids? Right. And I think that lends itself to the talk of adoption, the talk of foster care, but also then the talk of science and in vitro fertilization. And if life begins at conception, what do we do with that? And how do we enter into that, and the morals and ethics around that? So I think we probably need a follow-up episode in the next couple of episodes where we start doing a deeper dive into, like, what if you can't get pregnant as a Christian? Where do our biblical worldviews lead us from there? Yeah, that's good. So, and we will have that conversation. Hey, thank you guys for this conversation. That was great. And thank you for like writing this in again. Just like give us ideas. We want to hear your heart. We want to hear the things that maybe you're struggling with or you're going through, and that you would just hopefully allow us to talk about these things and listen in. And
But yeah, we just pray, church, that this conversation hopefully blesses you and you and your spouse or whoever it is that you're kind of wrestling with these things, talking through these things. So we thank you for submitting these questions. Thank you for listening, church, and we'll catch you next time.